June 6, 1944. A concealed ridge overlooking Omaha Beach, Normandy. A veteran German sniper adjusts the polished lens of his Zeiss ZF-42 scope, his thumb tracing the cold, precision-engineered bolt of his Kar 98K. He peers at the advancing GIs, mocking their clunky rifles and the crude, offset toy optics of the M1C. He believes a single, disciplined bolt-action shot is the pinnacle of warfare. He is wrong. He's about to hear a metallic ping that signals the death of his tactical world and the birth of an industrial slaughter. The contrast between the German Kar 98K and the American M1 Garand was not just a difference in caliber or weight. It was a fundamental collision of two incompatible civilizations. To the German High Command, the Kar 98K was a musical instrument of war. It was a masterpiece of old-world craftsmanship, built with a Mauser action so precise that it felt like a surgical tool in the hands of a trained grenadier. German military doctrine was built on the cult of the individual marksman. They believed that a single disciplined soldier with a bolt-action rifle could control the battlefield through superior marksmanship and cold, calculated efficiency. But the Kar 98K, for all its technical elegance, was a weapon of the past. It was a manual machine in an automated age. Every time a German soldier fired, he had to break his aim, reach for the bolt, and manually cycle the next round. It was a rhythmic, slow process that belonged to the 19th century. Across the line, the Americans were fielding a locomotive made of steel and walnut, the M1 Garand. To a German engineer, the Garand appeared crude and ungainly. It was heavy, it was semi-automatic, and it relied on a complex gas-operated system that the Germans initially dismissed as prone to failure. They saw the American soldier not as a marksman, but as an amateur who relied on volume because he lacked the skill for precision. They were catastrophically wrong. The M1 Garand was the ultimate expression of American industrial logic, the democratization of firepower. While Germany was obsessing over the finish and fit of a bolt-action masterpiece, America was mass-producing a semi-automatic beast that turned every ordinary infantryman into a one-man suppression team. The Garand didn't ask the soldier to be a master technician. It asked him to be a component in a high-speed assembly line of lead. This was industrial might rendered in wood and iron. The Kar 98K required the soldier to think between shots. The Garand allowed the soldier to react. In the humid hedgerows of Normandy, this technical disparity became a death sentence for the Wehrmacht. When a German squad engaged an American platoon, they found themselves facing an aluminum rain they couldn't conceive. For every single shot a German soldier could cycle through his bolt, an American GI could return 4. The Germans were fighting with the sin of perfection, believing that a handcrafted rifle would win the day. The Americans, meanwhile, were operating on the principle of pragmatic overload. They understood that in the chaos of modern infantry combat, the ability to keep the enemy's head down was infinitely more valuable than the aesthetic beauty of a Mauser bolt. By 1944, the toy scopes and crude designs the Germans had laughed at were silencing the finest snipers of the Reich. The M1 Garand wasn't just a rifle. It was a production line in the hands of a private. It was a locomotive that never stopped moving, a weapon that prioritized the mathematics of firepower over the traditions of the shooting range. The German grenadier was holding a masterpiece of the past, but the American GI was holding the future. And the future sounded like 8 rapid-fire cracks followed by a metallic ping that signaled the end of the German infantry rulebook. In the smoke-filled hedgerows of Normandy, the German sniper operated on a philosophy of one shot, one kill. He was a master of the bolt-action Kar 98K, a weapon that demanded the user be a technician, a craftsman of ballistics. But he was about to discover that American military logic wasn't interested in individual brilliance. It was interested in the mathematics of firepower. To a German grenadier, the math was simple and traditional. His Kar 98K held 5 rounds. After every shot, he had to manually cycle the bolt, a 2-second process that broke his sight picture and his rhythm. In a 10-second engagement, the German could theoretically fire 4 aimed shots. He was a singular predator operating a manual machine, but the American GI was part of a locomotive of lead. His M1 Garand held 8 rounds, and it didn't require him to lift a finger to reload. The mathematics of destruction for an American squad were staggering. While the German was fumbling with a bolt, a single American could shoot 8 rounds in less than 4 seconds. Let's look at the mathematics of firepower in a real combat scenario. A standard German squad of 10 men armed with bolt-action rifles could deliver approximately 40 aimed shots in 15 seconds. An American squad of the same size, armed with semi-automatic Garands, could deliver 160 shots in that same window. That is a 4-to-1 disparity in volume. The Americans didn't build their infantry around superhero snipers who needed 10 years of training. They built an industrial conveyor belt of lead. They understood that in the chaos of a firefight, the ability to suppress the enemy, to keep their heads down with sheer volume, was more lethal than any individual marksmanship award. This was aluminum rain applied to the individual soldier. German snipers who had mocked the American toy scopes and crude rifles found themselves paralyzed. They couldn't aim because every time they tried to cycle their bolt, 3 different GIs were truding 8 rounds each into their position. The Germans were fighting with jewelry in their hands, believing in the aesthetic of the perfect shot. The Americans were fighting with a production line, believing in the pragmatic reality of overwhelming force. The Kar 98K was a masterpiece of the past. The M1 Garand was a monster of the future. And as the metallic ping echoed across the battlefield, it wasn't just an empty clip falling to the ground. It was the sound of the German infantry manual being torn to pieces by the brute force of American industrial logic. In the smoke-filled forests of the Ardennes, a myth was born among the ranks of the Wehrmacht, a myth that would eventually lead thousands of German soldiers to their deaths. It was the legend of the M1 Ping. German veterans, desperate for any tactical advantage against the American industrial tide, whispered to their replacements that the M1 Garand was a weapon with a fatal flaw. They claimed that when the 8th round was fired, the heavy steel en-bloc clip would eject with a distinct, high-pitched metallic ping, signaling to everyone in the earshot that the American was empty. To the German tactical mind, this was the unbelievable truth they had been praying for. They believed they could wait for that sound, then rush the American position while he was vulnerable and fumbling for a new clip. It was a strategy built on the idea of individual agility. But the Americans had created a system that made individual agility irrelevant. The reality of the ping was not a trap for the Americans. It was a death sentence for the Germans. German intelligence had spent decades perfecting the science of the bolt-action Kar-98K, assuming every second of a firefight was a duel of gentlemen. They didn't realize that the American infantryman was never alone. The mathematics of firepower dictated that when one Garand pinged, 3 others were still trooting lead. An American squad didn't operate as 10 individuals. They operated as a continuous conveyor belt of fire. Furthermore, the technical reality of the Garand shattered the German plan. A trained GI didn't fumble with his reload. He could slam a fresh 8-round clip into the internal magazine and release the bolt in less than 1 second. By the time a German soldier had stood up from his cover to exploit the ping, he wasn't facing an empty rifle. He was facing a fresh locomotive of 8 more rounds already aimed at his chest. The Germans were obsessed with the sin of perfection, believing that they could win by outthinking the machine. But the Americans had industrialized the infantry fight. They knew that in the chaos of Normandy or the Ardennes, the sound of a falling clip was drowned out by the roar of the aluminum rain. German survivors later admitted that the ping was often the last thing they heard before being suppressed by a wall of fire they couldn't conceive. This was the carelessness of infinite resource applied to the rifle. The Americans didn't care if their rifle made a noise when it was empty, because they had enough ammunition and enough rifles to ensure that the noise was always followed by another volley.
An infinite supply, they
One
said.
German Unteroffizier, captured near St. Vith, recorded the realization. "We waited for the sound of the empty rifle. We heard the ping. We charged. But the Americans didn't stop shooting. They never stop shooting. They have more bullets than we have men." The ping legend was a fairy tale told by a dying empire to give its soldiers a reason to hope. But in the cold logic of American production, hope was a secondary concern. The M1 Garand was a monster of the future that prioritized the mathematics of firepower over the traditions of the firing range. The Germans pursued the sin of individual skill, but the Americans created a system that turned every soldier into a manufacturing plant of destruction. The rule book hadn't just been changed, it had been incinerated. July 1944. The town of Saint-Lô, France, had become a graveyard of stone and iron. Among the ruins of the hedgerow hell, a single American platoon from the 29th Infantry Division found itself pinned down in a drainage ditch, trapped by the clinical precision of a German sniper nest. The German Marksman, a veteran of the Eastern Front, sat behind his Zeiss optics with a calm, predatory arrogance. He knew the Americans were amateurs. He knew that for every shot he fired, they would fumble with their bolt-action rifles, giving him a 3-second window to relocate and kill again. He was operating on a rule book written in 1918. He didn't know the rule book had been incinerated by American industry. The platoon leader, a 22-year-old lieutenant from Indiana, didn't call for a super sniper to engage in a gentleman's duel. He didn't need a masterpiece of marksmanship. He had the mathematics of firepower on his side. He gave a single, sharp command, and the ditch erupted. It wasn't the rhythmic, slow clatter of bolt-action fire. It was a semi-automatic aluminum rain. 12 M1 Garands began trooting lead at a rate the German veteran had never conceived possible. Each GI wasn't aiming for a headshot. They were aiming for the entire building. The mathematics were staggering. In the first 5 seconds of the engagement, the Americans delivered 96 rounds of .30-06 ammunition into the sniper's stone window. The German, struggling to cycle his Mauser bolt for a second shot, was literally buried under a wall of lead and masonry. This was the carelessness of infinite resource applied to a single street corner. The Americans weren't wasting bullets. They were using volume to erase a tactical problem. German Unteroffizier Friedrich Müller, who witnessed the engagement from a nearby cellar, recorded the shock in a letter home. "The Americans do not fire like soldiers," he wrote. "They fire like a factory. When we fire once, they return a hurricane. Their rifles never seem to stop. We waited for the pause, for the reload, but it never came." The sound is not a series of shots, but a continuous roar of steel. Müller was witnessing the sin of perfection being dismantled by pragmatic overload. While the German sniper was a dinosaur of elite skill, the American GIs were locomotives of production. They were rat-hole dwellers, conduit pipes for an industrial machine that could produce more ammunition in an hour than the sniper's village could in a year. The sniper relied on his Zeiss lens. The Americans relied on the fact that they had 500 rounds per man and a rifle that didn't require them to break their aim. The unbelievable truth of Saint-Lô was that individual skill had been superseded by industrial arithmetic. The German marksman was a craftsman of death, but he was facing a corporation of destruction. When the Americans finally moved forward, they found the German position shredded. The sniper's ZF-42 scope, a masterpiece of German optics, was shattered by a dozen simultaneous hits. He had been looking for a duel, but he found a production line. This cinematic reality shattered the morale of the Wehrmacht's infantry. Every hedgerow, every stone wall, and every ruined attic in Saint-Lô became a site where German warrior culture died a messy death at the hands of American worker logic. The Americans didn't win because they were better snipers. They won because they could turn a street into a storm of aluminum rain while the Germans were still counting their remaining cartridges. The toy scopes and crude rifles the Germans had laughed at in June were, by July, the instruments of an unstoppable industrial tsunami. The thunder had spoken in the ruins of Saint-Lô, and the rulebook of infantry warfare was changed forever by the sheer, unrefined volume of the American machine. In the meticulously documented world of German military science, the optics manufactured by Zeiss and Leitz were considered military jewelry. The ZF-4 and ZF-42 scopes were technical masterpieces, offering clarity and precision that made every other optic in the world look like a toy. To a German sniper instructor, an American M1 equipped with an M81 or M84 scope was a joke, a crude, offset piece of glass with a narrow field of view and limited magnification. They believed that because they had the best glass, they had the best marksman. What the German high command failed to grasp was the mathematics of availability. Germany pursued the sin of perfection, crafting high-end optics that required hundreds of man-hours to assemble. The result was a masterpiece, but a masterpiece that was only available to a tiny, elite fraction of the army. By 1944, while a handful of German snipers had the world's best vision, the average German grenadier was still squinting over iron sights. The Americans, meanwhile, embraced the pragmatism of the assembly line. They didn't want to build a few thousand perfect scopes. They wanted to equip tens of thousands of good-enough marksmen. The M84 was rugged, simple to manufacture, and designed to be mounted on a rifle that was rolling off the production line every few seconds. It wasn't military jewelry, it was an industrial tool. The disparity in production was staggering. Germany managed to produce roughly 150,000 sniper-capable optics throughout the entire war. During the same period, American industry flooded the front lines with millions of optical devices, from rifle scopes to binoculars to tank sights. To the American mind, a scope that was 80% as good as a Zeiss, but available to 800% more soldiers, was the superior weapon. This was mass production applied to human vision. When a German squad encountered an American platoon, they weren't just facing one elite sniper with a perfect lens. They were facing an entire unit, where every other man had some form of magnification. German Oberleutnant Klaus Mettelmann recorded the frustration in his memoirs. "The Americans have so many scopes," he wrote, "that even their common infantrymen can see us before we see them. Their glass is not as clear as our Zeiss, but there is so much of it that our clarity becomes irrelevant." The Germans were blinded by their own excellence. They spent their precious resources on a handful of dinosaur optics, huge, complex, and difficult to replace. The Americans built locomotives, tough, interchangeable, and relentless. If an American scope broke, he threw it away and drew a new one from a supply crate. If a Zeiss lens cracked, the German sniper was effectively out of the war. By the time the fighting reached the Siegfried Line, the toys the Germans had laughed at were everywhere. American industry had commodified the long-range kill. They had turned the art of sniping into the utility of suppression. The German sniper was still looking for a duel between master craftsmen, but he was being dismantled by a corporation of marksmen. The Zeiss scope remained a masterpiece of engineering, but the M84 was a masterpiece of victory. The thunder had spoken, and the Americans proved that in total war, a tool of production will always beat a work of art. By late 1944, a profound psychological rot had settled into the German sniper corps. An elite fraternity that had once considered themselves the untouchable masters of the European battlefield. On the Eastern Front, they had hunted with surgical patience, believing that the superior German individual could always defeat the masses through technical skill. But in the hedgerows of France, they encountered a reality that didn't just challenge their skill, it made their skill irrelevant. It was the industrialization of death, and it was delivered 8 rounds at a time. For a German sniper, the battlefield was a series of tactical choices. He fired a single shot from his Kar 98K, then waited, breathed, and cycled his bolt. It was a slow, deliberate dance. But when he engaged an American squad, the response was a locomotive of lead that defied every military textbook. The German expected a pause. He expected a moment of American vulnerability. Instead, he found that every American infantryman was a walking production line. The M1 Garand didn't fire shots. It generated a hurricane. The psychological impact of the 8-round rule book was devastating. German Obergefreiter Friedrich Baum recorded in his journal, "We were told the Americans were soft that they lacked the iron will of the sniper. But how can you fight an enemy who never stops shooting? We aim for the heart, but they aim for the entire forest. When we fire one bullet, they return 1,000. It is not a battle. It is a mechanical erasure. Baum was witnessing the sin of perfection being crushed by the mathematics of firepower. The unbelievable truth was that the Americans didn't need to be better marksmen. They simply had to be enough. In the dense terrain of Normandy, a German sniper would fire from a concealed position, expecting to relocation during the American reload. But the reload never came. Instead, the aluminum rain intensified. While the German was fumbling with his Mauser bolt, a 19th century ritual, the American GI was already trooting a fresh 8-round clip. The sound of the ping wasn't a signal of weakness. It was a rhythmic pulse of a machine that had no end. This was pragmatic overload in its purest form. The German snipers, the dinosaurs of elite marksmanship, stood silent at the fences of POW camps, watching endless truckloads of American ammunition roll toward the front. They realized that their Zeiss lenses and their hand-fitted bolts were military jewelry in a war of industrial tools. They had been trained to win a duel, but they were participating in their own execution. Every American foxhole had become a factory. Every GI was a conduit for a supply system that considered 1,000,000 rounds of .30-06 a rounding error. The German soldiers saw American troops discard half-used clips or fire at empty bushes just to maintain the rhythm of the advance. To a soldier from a nation scraping for every liter of fuel and every single cartridge, this casual waste was the ultimate instrument of terror. It was the realization that America had so much they could afford to be imperfect and still win. The myth of German superiority died in the shadow of the M1 Garand. The warriors of the Reich discovered they were fighting an enemy whose waste exceeded German total production. They weren't defeated by better snipers. They were drowned by an industrial tsunami that treated the individual rifle like a high-speed assembly line. The thunder had spoken, and as the German snipers walked into captivity, they understood the bitter truth. In a war of resources, a craftsman will always be crushed by the factory. The M1 Garand was more than just a rifle. It was a physical manifestation of American industrial logic. While the German High Command spent decades obsessing over the sin of perfection, crafting bolt-action masterpieces for an elite few, the United States built a locomotive for the masses. They understood that the individual warrior, no matter how skilled with his Zeiss optics, could not survive a collision with a production line. The mathematics of destruction at the infantry level were absolute. By 1945, American industry had delivered over 5.4 million M1 Garands. That's not just a number. It is a tidal wave of semi-automatic Hua-Look that redefined the rules of engagement. The Germans had chased the myth of the one-shot, one-kill, but the Americans embraced the reality of 8 rounds, 1 second. They traded the jewelry of the craftsman for the utility of the factory, and in doing so, they commodified the victory of the common soldier. The aluminum rain that fell upon the hedgerows of Normandy and the forests of the Ardennes proved that in a total war, logistics is strategy. The German sniper was a dinosaur, a relic of a bygone era who relied on a manual bolt in a world of gas-operated speed. Every metallic ping was a signal that the American machine was reloading, not resting. It was the sound of a system that assumed 20% waste and 100% redundancy, a system where the mathematics of availability crushed the tradition of the sharpshooter. Ultimately, the conflict was decided by a fundamental difference in faith. The Germans believed in the precision of the individual, but the Americans believed in the capacity of the collective. They didn't need every soldier to be an ace. They needed every soldier to be a conduit for the most powerful industrial engine on Earth. The M1 Garand didn't just win firefights. It proved that a nation's output is its ultimate weapon. The thunder had spoken, and the infantry rulebook was rewritten in wood and steel. The era of the bolt-action artisan was over, buried under the unrefined volume of the American assembly line. Because while the sniper was still aiming, the factory had already won. German snipers believed they were the masters of the woods, until the M1 Garand proved that quantity has a quality all its own. But the mathematics of firepower didn't stop at the rifle. If you think 8 rounds in 2 seconds was terrifying, wait until you see what happened when American industrial logic was applied to the big guns. Click here to watch our next video, Steel Rain, how American artillery transformed the battlefield into a 24-hour production line of destruction. The Germans believed in the precision of a sniper. The Americans believed in the mass production of an army.